man's got to know his limitations.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. After Srila Prabhupada departed in late 1977, 6 more major deviations by the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation were still yet to come. These made many devotees even more blind to what we need now to recover, namely a rational conception of the movement's accurate history. This entails inquiry as to where it, only apparently, is in sync with the Guru Parampara, because in point of fact, it does not tally with any genuine disciplic succession whatsoever. As a starting point, the ideal of Krishna-conscious rationality is the working principles of Buddha Yoga, and they are never implicated in dead-end philosophy. 3 major deviations in the first years after Prabhupada departed attempted to kill that Buddha Yoga, and the attempt was somewhat successful. The 11 pretender Mahabhagavats imposed upon the movement their vision, which they claimed was perfect and absolute and, in effect, transcendental to rationality. As long as their impositions were not confronted and are not confronted with the working principles of Buddha Yoga, to expose their rascaldom, what abuses, physical, astral, or pseudo-spiritual, might not the ISKCON hierarchy commit? What will they not cover up if they are not confronted now? Where, if anywhere, is there a line that the current crop of pretenders will not cross? Considering what they have already done to Prabhupada's movement, what atrocity is beyond the pale for them? Oh, now, they may cry love and trust every now and then, but that trust was shattered in March of 1978. It is your host speaker's duty to report that fact, which was the most egregious deviation. And, along with it, in this presentation, to report 2 other major deviations that sandwiched it in the same time frame. There will be no compromised version of historical reality here, and the facts of what really went down will speak for themselves. The entrenched ISKCON establishment will continue to ignore all of this, of course, but in due course, they will be threatened by it, and rightly so. Their organized religion was converted into an institutional delusion. We are far, far past the point of any effective reform now, as ISKCON deviations are too mainstream to rectify. Still, you need to know the history of what created the current paradigm. Only a few months after Prabhupada departed, the 7th major deviation began when some of his leading secretaries approached Swami B.R. Sridhar in Navadvip, West Bengal. There, they received some very bad advice. After that description, we shall proceed to the 8th deviation, namely the imposition of the zonal acharyas, the 11 great pretenders. And they were precipitated and propelled in no small part by that previous so-called consultation with a higher authority. And we shall close this presentation with the 9th major deviation, although most devotees do not recognize its importance. Some have not even heard about it. Once the fact became known that there was no appointment of gurus made by Prabhupada, the ninth deviation was the fallback which rationalized why the imposition was nevertheless still bona fide. However, first we must discuss something else. In the last week of December 1977, only 6 weeks after Prabhupada departed physical manifestation, Kirtanananda Swami began taking Uttama Adhikari worship and initiating new disciples at his rural compound just outside Moundsville, West Virginia. He did not consult the governing body commission before making this decision and taking this action. He accepted worship from everyone there, including his own godbrothers and godsisters. Certainly, there was considerable psychic pressure on all the devotees to engage in this worship. But the vast majority of them were already accustomed to some kind of form of it because they believed that Kirtanananda Swami was a pure devotee, which he most certainly was not. His so-called New Vrindavan compound was rather insular, and word of his initiation program did not spread throughout the movement. Indeed, most of Prabhupada's initiates in all of the other temples in America, what to speak of internationally, had no idea that Kirtanananda had jumped the shark and was initiating disciples and taking worship reserved for the rare Mahabhagavat. However, ISKCON leaders naturally soon became aware of it. The issue was whether or not ISKCON should confront Kirtanananda, whether they should allow him to continue his program. Now, confronting him probably would have resulted in a minor conflagration in the early going, because it was well known that the fellow did his own thing and had little, if any, respect for other senior men. Another way of saying the same thing is that Kirtanananda took direction from no one. In his manuscript exposing the 1978 imposition, the dissident Sulochan, destined to be assassinated in the spring of 1986 by one of Kirtanananda's trained enforcers, asked the following question, quote, "Has anyone ever seen Kirtanananda pay his obeisances to any of his godbrothers?" Unquote. It was a rhetorical question. Kirtanananda took obeisances. He did not give them. The weak leaders of ISKCON decided to let the Moundsville program go on. They decided to ride it out until Mayapur and settle any controversy there. That was probably a big mistake on their part, but the question is, did Kirtanananda's action constitute a major deviation? Did it actually spawn in a big way the development of the ISKCON Confederation? Did it constitute a deviation integral to the conversion of the ISKCON institution into a Sahajya movement? Now, in terms of negative and affirmative, solid arguments could be made on both sides. On the side that it did constitute a major event and deviation, it obviously influenced all of the other Ritviks to follow his lead. Otherwise, they would have had to have taken him on in Mayapur by insisting that they were all only regular gurus under the regulation of Vidhi Sadhana Bhakti. As we all know, they opted for the path of least resistance. In reality, Kirtanananda's action had limited influence. We do not know how it would have played out if the GBC had confronted him, because they did not do so. But his egotistical, narcissistic pretension, it did not constitute a chief reason why the other quote-unquote 10 little Indian boys, as Kirtanananda pejoratively referred to them, why they accepted the zonal acharya paradigm. It was really only a marginal influence, his jumping of the gun. We get a hint of that fact by remembering in the mid-80s, the GBC finally did confront Kirtanananda. Now, how did that play out? By the mid-90s, Kirtanananda no longer controlled and then was no longer even allowed to live at his Shangri-La in the woods. Kirtanananda could have caused some ruckus for a brief time in 1978 if the GBC had demanded then that he capitulate and act only as a regular guru. However, as we all know, they opted for the extravagant worship program instead. Along with the division of the world into 11 zones as quasi-monarchical fiefdoms, along with control of the commish in the form of the Acharya Board. Kirtanananda influenced some decisions by the governing body in 1978, granted, but only at the margins. He was not a conclusive factor in the devolution of the Hare Krishna movement at that time. The Vanity Fair despot was never going to be any kind of regular guru, despite the fact that that was all that Prabhupada ever authorized. Let us also not forget that he authorized regular guru only in a generic way. He never recognized or appointed any of his disciples as Diksha Guru, at least not officially. Kirtanananda wanted the whole enchilada, and he simply decided to take it. The other 10 took similar action, but they waited for the institutional imprimatur from the GBC before they began to be worshipped as rubber-stamped Mahasahajiyas. In conclusion here, the former Keith Ham was a sideshow in the late 70s. The GBC was more powerful than he was. Indeed, there was another far more powerful influence than him, which did produce the fateful deviation of March 1978. Let us now discuss two important reasons for that deviation, which history will show had more negative impact than Kirtanananda's antics at his woodland playground. Previous to the Mayapur conclave, a number of senior men and leading secretaries paid visits to Swami B.R. Sridhar at his Gaudiya Math in Navadvip. This man was a senior godbrother to Srila Prabhupada, and he was quite influential during the heyday of the Math. He also proved very influential just after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati left physical manifestation in early 1937. Swami B.R. Sridhar had been one of the 13 original commissioners on that cult's appointed governing body, which most unfortunately elected another member of the commission, known as Ananta Vasudev, who was also a sannyasi. They elected him as the sole acharya and successor of their spiritual master Siddhanta Saraswati. The vote was 8-5, and Swami B.R. Sridhar voted in favor of that so-called successor appointment. This created a major schism in the Mutt, as the other 5 who voted against it, led by a very influential money man, administrator, and confidant of Srila Saraswati, disagreed vehemently with the appointment, and they broke away. Ananta Vasudev, in due course of time, left the sannyas order, acrimoniously ditched the Gaudiya Math, spoke against the teachings and the organization of his spiritual master, rejected Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and came to a most inglorious end, which need not be described here. Now, in 1978, with Prabhupada no longer part of the scene, his foolish leading men, at least many of them, decided to consult Swami B.R. Sridhar for direction as to how they were to conduct the ISKCON mission after the passing of the founder Acharya. As it turned out, they got very, very bad advice from him on at least 3 occasions. As one of my godbrothers put it some years later, Swami B.R. Sridhar was instrumental in destroying one devotional branch, the Gaudiya Math, and then 40 years later, he did the same thing to Srila Prabhupada's branch. The number of meetings that went down between different groups of Prabhupada's senior initiated disciples in the Navadvip Mahant is difficult to ascertain. That number is not important to know. What is important is what he told them and what they then bought into and implemented. Transcripts of the talks he had with the various sets of devotees were available to senior disciples in ISKCON, your host speaker being the personal secretary for a governing body commissioner in the spring of 1978, had access to either most or all of those transcripts at that time when they were first circulated. When I read them, what was contained in them was both foreboding and even a bit shocking. Besides those transcripts of the room conversations in Navadvip, one of the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats, designated by the GBC to do so, penned a position paper which gave a cursory explanation of the New Guru program. It discussed the zonal Acharya system that was then being implemented, as well as justifications and rationalizations for why it was allegedly bona fide. Swami B.R. Sridhar, in terms of his bad advice, was central to those justifications. As a matter of fact, that position paper contained the subtitle, quote, "In consultation with higher authorities," unquote. That the final noun was put in plural was a stretch, to say the least. The only so-called authority who was consulted and summarily quoted in this position paper, written by Satsvarup, was Swami B.R. Sridhar. His directives, such as the concept of the zonal Acharya, as well as his philosophical slogans, provided fertile ground for the ambitious seeds of the 11 deviant upstarts, the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats. It provided them fertile ground to sprout, and sprout they did very quickly. In their first visit to him, the initial contingent of leading secretaries and sannyasis were asked about the basis of the 11 gurus, which by that time had either been recognized as gurus or were on the verge of being so. Was there a direct order, the Swami asked? The reply to the Navadvip Mahant was that the 11 had been appointed as Ritvik Acharyas. To this, Swami B.R. Sridhar replied, quote, "Ritvik Acharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya," unquote. The meaning of this ditty was not difficult to ascertain, namely that the Ritviks, appointed by Prabhupada in July, had automatically been converted into full-blown Diksha gurus upon the founder's disappearance. Oh, this played right into TKG's plan, which, at least short-term, worked like a charm. On many bulletin boards throughout the movement, there had already been pinned a paper mixing the Ritviks from July 1977 with the new gurus, as if they were one and the same thing. The devotees at large were unable to differentiate them. All 11 were understood, or rather misunderstood, to have been appointed to have been appointed as Diksha Gurus. In this, but one of his catchy phrases or slogans, some of which were even a little bit intoxicating, Swami B.R. Sridhar therein gave his stamp of approval to the zonal acharya scheme and the imitation of Uttama Adhikari by so-called Ritviks that had become automatically Diksha Gurus. Now, there was also his worn Bengali slogan, Mat Guru Si Jagaguru. In this gem, Swami B.R. Sridhar instructs all the assembled fools that the disciple must see his guru as a Jagaguru, which is another term for Mahabhagavat. Without such, in this case false faith, the disciple allegedly cannot remain loyal to his spiritual master. Then Swami B.R. Sridhar went on to further explain, quote unquote, it is to deceive the disciple. Quote, it is to deceive the disciple, unquote. Such great advice, promoting deception as integral to spreading Krishna consciousness and the guru-disciple relationship, so-called. Now he also applied a wartime analogy in which posters in India had read, quote, just put on the uniform and you will become the soldier, unquote. This was applied to the 11 new gurus who had now been urged by the Swami, actually enjoined by him, to pretend to be Uttama Adhikaris, accepting worship equal to what Prabhupada had accepted. Just cut the profile, the Swami urged. Walk the walk and talk the talk, although you and some of your god brothers will know who you actually are and what you pretend to be. Now, these were all damaging, no doubt, but Swami B.R. Sridhar's two most significant contributions, or more accurately, final kicks to Prabhupada's branch of the Chaitanya line, were the concoctions of zonal acharya and the Acharya board within the GBC. The Navadvip Mahant urged the ISKCON leaders to implement zones for their gurus, who had now each been magically transformed into the sum total of all demigods. They must each have their own zones in the world, similar to what they possessed as governing body commissioners. For the record, genuine gurus are never limited like that, nor are they supposed to claim control of any specific geographical territory. But the Swami opined otherwise, and that bad advice was swallowed, hook, line, and sinker. Swami B.R. Sridhar also told one of the groups who visited him, and similarly got poisoned by his intoxicating and bad advice, that a guru cannot be subject to correction or be controlled by anyone. By this he meant, and it was specifically made clear, that the GBC could not tell any of the new gurus what they could and could not do. They were G, U, R, U, S. They were spiritual masters. They were to be worshipped on the highest level. How could any of the other commissioners or anyone else have any say in the matter of how they conducted their missions? As such, the Acharya board was created within the GBC. It was almost certainly voted into existence, which meant that some of the non-gurus, of course they were all non-gurus, also must have voted for it. The Acharya board was sort of a governing commission within a commission of the GBC and was not subject to GBC rulings or mandates. This was cent per cent against how the GBC was supposed to operate. Yet the new gurus saw that it was certainly to their advantage, so they made sure that this Acharya board became an ontological entity, but it did not last long.
I have a question.
Bhakta Ernest.
Wasn't Swami B.R. Sridhar supposed to be approached, according to Prabhupada's authorization, for direction as how to implement initiations after his disappearance? Didn't he also authorize that for philosophical direction as well?
Where is the proof of this? That everyone was led to believe that Prabhupada gave some kind of directive similar to what you speak of here. Where can we verify that he did so? Not just by word of mouth, but by direct evidence. Was there any tape recording of this so-called directive? Any mention of it in a letter? Any document whatsoever? No, there is no such proof. This belief in some kind of last days room conversation directive from Prabhupada to go to Swami B.R. Sridhar cannot be substantiated in any tangible way other than the old hackneyed Prabhupada said. Now, that's one point. Over and above this, why was his bad advice and philosophy accepted? Palina parchiyate, judged by the results. The results that ensued as a consequence of following his bad advice more or less totally corrupted Prabhupada's movement. None of that quackery was authorized in Prabhupada's books or letters. Swami B.R. Sridhar mucked up the movement in a very big way. But in the beginning, everybody, or almost everybody, bought into what he peddled, and then they went on to implement it. They did so for a variety of reasons. But they were under no obligation to have done that. They were instead duty-bound to have rejected his unauthorized philosophy. With the exception of the Neo-Mutt wildcards today, virtually everyone readily admits that none of his bad advice should have been accepted. It was the duty of Prabhupada's senior men to have protected the movement and his devotees from having been led down that yellow brick road to the abyss of the first transformation. Tatvamasi.
Vasu Gopal has a question.
Vasu Gopal.
Since he was Prabhupada's elder godbrother, I have heard we are not supposed to criticize Swami B.R. Sridhar. Didn't Prabhupada even say that he accepted him as his Shiksha Guru? Even if there was some flaw to it, isn't it an offense to point out anything Swami B.R. Sridhar said or did in relation to our movement?
That is the etiquette granted. However, Swami B.R. Sridhar, from his end, breached that etiquette in a very big way. He was never authorized by Vaishnava etiquette to have interfered with Prabhupada's movement to the extent that he did and in the way that he did. He even reinitiated one of Prabhupada's disciples, which was a major breach of etiquette, previously done also by Swami Ban. Swami B.R. Sridhar, by such an egregious display of interference and bad advice, which continued into the 80s and was the basis of the first splinter group from Prabhupada's movement, or so-called movement, that first splinter group being Neo-Mutt, of course. He provided fertile deviant soil in which the personally ambitious zonal acharyas grew spectacularly. To say that he had a profound negative impact on Prabhupada's line is an understatement. His advice, his directives, his philosophy, they all set the stage for all kinds of deviations. And if you walk back the cat on many or most of those, they trace right back to the Navadvip Mahant. As such, we are fully justified to discard the etiquette here. because the man and his advice must be exposed for just what it was and what it accomplished. Without such rejection, you cannot put the pieces of the puzzle together, and your so-called understanding of the history of the movement, post-Prabhupada, will always be inaccurate. Now, as far as this Shiksha Guru allegation is concerned, it was employed by Prabhupada in order to get his first disciple, Achyutananda, away from Swami Ban in Vrindavan. Ban had already allured one of Prabhupada's initiates away and had reinitiated that poor fellow. By over-glorifying Swami B.R. Sridhar in a letter to Achyutananda, the effect was to get Achyutananda to leave Uttar Pradesh and go live in Navadvip at a place where Swami Ban could no longer influence Achyutananda. At that time, Swami B.R. Sridhar was somewhat favorable to Prabhupada, and the ploy worked. Swami Ban was thwarted. But as far as Swami B.R. Sridhar being Prabhupada's Shiksha Guru, as far as that's concerned, does any rational devotee think that such a relationship was possible? Prabhupada inferior to the Navadvip Mahant? It is a preposterous claim by the fanatics of Neomat, who may still believe it or claim that they still believe it. Let us now segue to the eighth major event and deviation, the one that, more than any of the others, converted and degraded Prabhupada's Hare Krishna movement into the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. Of course, we are referring to the imposition of the zonal Acharya concoction. In this chronological presentation of the chief events conducive to the formation and growth of so-called ISKCON, this eighth deviation was, without doubt, the worst of the bunch. For a number of reasons, there is no need to go granular in explaining it. First of all, most of you already have quite a bit of knowledge about it, with many of you having experienced all the hell that it produced for about 8 years. Secondly, this event alone could merit a multi-part series of analysis on its own. Perhaps your host speaker will decide to do that in the future, but not at this time in this presentation. Now, to summarize, the 11, appointed only as Ritviks in July 1977, declared themselves to be completely pure devotees, to be Mahabhagavats, to be Uttama Adhikaris on the highest level of realization and power in Krishna consciousness. All 11 of these deceptive and dastardly fellows were governing body commissioners. That fact certainly facilitated them in pushing through the imposition and receiving the imprimatur from the governing body. Now, as such, since they already controlled zones allotted to them by the GBC, they carved out guru zones for themselves quite easily. As zonal acharyas, the guru zones either matched or were very similar to their GBC zones, although there were notable exceptions to that. After all, Swami B.R. Sridhar had advised, quote, acharyas of the zone, unquote. So that concoction from the Navadvip Mahant fit right into the method that the 11 great pretenders implemented in their scam. And oh, what an overbearing, nasty scam it was. There was no discussion to be had about it, or as one of the great pretenders said, when the 11 got together in India to discuss how to present this new arrangement to the devotees in the West, quote, don't explain anything to them, tell them, unquote. And that's how it went down. Everyone was told that Prabhupada had appointed these 11 men as Diksha Gurus. False. Everyone was told that they were now to be worshipped as good as God with so-called vyasasans installed in every temple for that purpose. False and fraudulent. Every pujari was told that he or she had to worship as part of the ritual, a picture of the zonal acharya on the altar at any given temple. Another fraud. Most of them also concocted pada names for themselves in clear imitation of Prabhupada. A former Andy Warhol buddy called himself Vishnupad. Outrageous. Another guy took the title Bhaktipad. One of the heterosexuals was called Gurupad, who later would admit to a sexual affair with his female secretary. In point of fact, most of these 11 men had sexual liaisons with either their disciples or godsisters during the course of their pretense. Another one was called Acharya Dev. This was the scholar who rationalized the so-called Shastric basis which facilitated their imitation of Prabhupada. This whole thing went down during the infamous late March meetings in 1978 in Mayapur, where the plot was hatched and instituted by GBC edict. All 11 of these deviants were so absorbed in self-apotheosis that they completely forgot their limitations, which would begin playing out individually and then collectively in a short time. They overlorded and enjoyed all the amenities and manpower that Prabhupada's movement had accrued over 11 years of his personal potent preaching, organizational skills, and example. He had told them all at Krishna Balaram less than a year previously, quote, regular guru, that's all, unquote, but they chose to forget that limitation. Of course, even if they had decided not to imitate Uttama Adhikari, none of those 11 men were anywhere near the platform of regular guru. None of them were Madhyams, and once they foisted the pretender Mahabhagavat scam on the ISKCON movement, converting it into an Uppa Sampradaya in the process, they all became full-blown Sahajiyas of the very worst variety in the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Please note, however, that some of them already were Sahajiyas previous to the implementation of the zonal Acharya concoction.
Gokulananda has a question.
Gokulananda.
Since the zonal acharyas hijacked both the GBC and the movement in March of 1978, and they were the real beneficiaries of what was then imposed, shouldn't this major deviation be pinned solely on the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats and their false claim that Prabhupada appointed them Diksha Gurus?
Actually, the tail of the donkey should be pinned right where it belongs, namely on the vitiated GBC. The GBC could have and should have stopped this deviation. It should have stopped Kirtanananda no later than January of 1978. It should have confronted him at that time and set the tone for the annual spring meeting. Either all or almost all of the governing body commissioners were present at Krishna Balaram in late May, when Prabhupada clearly said, regular guru, that's all. And they all should have known that he only appointed Ritviks and never officially appointed anyone as Diksha Guru. The whole debacle is on the GBC. Let us now consider the 9th major deviation, although it is not recognized as being a major event, at least not by most devotees. After this presentation, that will change. First, there is some need for a little background. Once the zonal acharya scheme was put into place, you had to go along to get along in the ISKCON movement. By the midsummer of 1978, almost every devotee who did not accept it was no longer serving in any of those temples, your host speaker included, of course, as having either been directly driven out or indirectly by utter revulsion of what was going down. Those 11 men had their loyalists, their henchmen, sycophants, and of course their own so-called initiated disciples. It was, by the midsummer of 78, their movement. But it's a mistake to think that there was a lot of disillusionment about the new system wafting about anywhere and everywhere at that time. On the contrary, those many bamboozled by the program were enamored and exhilarated by the new gurus and the new liberal, read permissive, atmosphere that had been let loose, most notably in America. This was especially evident among the gold-plated grifters. The current Hinduization and its accompanying revenue was nowhere to be seen at that time. All the centers still relied upon the pick in order to please both their new guru and the temple president and carry on temple functions. Los Angeles was the nerve center of the pick. This was well known. And two prominent female devotees, namely Jadharani and Mula Prakriti, were the best of the best as far as collection and book distribution were concerned. As such, they were very important, if not essential, to that scene. They led the female collectors who always topped the charts on the Sankirtan newsletter. The Achilles heel of the 11 new gurus proved to be their inability to get along with each other despite having separate and usually very extensive playgrounds as fiefdoms for their autocratic shenanigans and showmanship. Some did actually get along, and even more than that, deeply respected their fellow so-called masters, but such was not the case in California. There, the zonal acharyas of Northern California and Southern California despised each other with great prejudice. One had Jewish genetics, the other German. That exacerbated their mutual contempt. In the late 70s, the two aforementioned female collectors were true believers. They bought into the propaganda that all the 11 were pure devotees, and they worshiped them as such. They were also up close and personal with Rameshvara, the zonal acharya for Southern California. He had always been heavy into collection by hook or by crook, and these two young women were what made the female collection go. In due course, they overheard him calling the Northern California zonal a schmuck, amongst other vulgarities. And this befuddled them. It was a major contradiction, since, in their minds, all the 11 were pure devotees. How could one call another one a schmuck? They rationalized that it had to be some kind of lila. That lila rationalization didn't hold water for long. Finally, Jadharani requested, or perhaps she demanded, to listen to the so-called appointment tape. This was the illusory name, the illusory tag, of the recording of the May 28th room conversation with the GBC at Krishna Balaram. We have discussed it previously. She fully expected it to verify that Prabhupada had appointed all the 11 gurus, as that was the cult-wide propaganda. This tape had been kept strictly confidential at Los Angeles, and this was the first time that Rameshvara released it to anyone. Bad play, Leo. When she listened to it, she discovered, to her shock and revulsion, that there was no appointment of anyone to anything on it. The Ritviks had not been appointed on it. And along with Mula, she would learn later that the Ritviks got their appointment in the second week of July 1977, well after the Krishna Balaram room conversation. Jadurani was flabbergasted, embarrassed, and forced to realize by shock that she had been duped by Rameshwar, and by extension the other 10 also. And most importantly, she was determined to do something about it. As word got around in 1980 and position papers were distributed, that's a very long story, the whole so-called ISKCON movement, as far as that zonal paradigm was concerned, was in danger of cratering. It eventually became common knowledge that Prabhupada did not appoint anyone as Diksha Guru. What to speak of meriting Uttama worship? What to speak of being his successor? Now, if there had been the internet at that time, the ISKCON authority structure would have collapsed. But back in those days, it took a lot of time to get the word out. Many of the leaders of so-called ISKCON went into the psychic equivalent of DEFCON 5. If the big lie was exposed, the attrition rate would skyrocket, and all hell could and probably would break loose in their cult. Somebody had to come up with a solution to this problem, which would metastasize if it was not nipped now in the bud. Most ironically, that somebody turned out to be Kirtanananda. Although 3 syllogisms, all of which are flawed at either the major premise or the minor premise, are required in order to complete the bad logic, the solution was not presented like that. It was presented much simpler. Basically, what he presented was as follows. Prabhupada, all right, he didn't appoint any gurus, but he did appoint the GBC. And since the GBC appointed the Diksha Gurus, that was just as good. For the many brainwashed of so-called ISKCON, this rationalization sufficed. Even if there was some deception, or what so-called ISKCON leaders would claim to be an innocent, mistaken conception, in falsely claiming that the appointment of the 11 Diksha Gurus was Prabhupada's, that was now apparently overcome. The zonal Acharya system of Uttama Adhikari worship was still bona fide because the GBC approved it, and Prabhupada empowered, allegedly, the GBC as the final authority. Thus, this early 80s fallback rationale checked the developing situation and its momentum toward probable collapse. Kirtanananda's evil genius in devising this rationalization would come back to bite him big time in less than 5 years. But he was the man of the hour when his A equals B, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, misapplied logic, formulated with subtle embedded misconceptions, when it came to the rescue. It should have then been recognized for just what it was, but it must be recognized now for what it is, namely a major deviation and a major event, because it delayed the final paroxysms of the zonal Acharya imposition by at least 7 years. The whole thing might have otherwise been brought down much earlier, and possibly even with genuine reform. The so-called center of the movement held in the early 80s. For a while. Now, in the later half of the 80s, due to an irreconcilably divided board of directors, your host speaker was forced to place the Mount Kailas property in Lake County, California, up for sale. This was practically the only thing that the 4 devotees on the corporate board could agree upon, so a local Ukiah realtor was given the exclusive. Just previous to this, we had won a contested and colorful lawsuit, which cost us $13,000 in attorney and legal fees, against the former master and commander of this mountain hideaway. It had been the crown jewel of his zone in the early 80s, and it was where he had made his chief domicile back then. After the lawsuit, he still wanted something from us, and my second in command, formerly his right young disciple, wanted something from him. As such, a meeting was arranged at Mount Kailas to settle some preliminaries and arrange logistics for a bigger exchange. The former Krishna Kirtan Thakur dropped by one sunny afternoon for a visit back to his old stomping grounds. He and I sat comfortably on the front deck of the main building, and our discussion was civil and even a bit friendly. Soon enough, the topic of the Zonalacharya era came up, which by that time had already crashed and burned. For him, it had ended much earlier in May of 1983 when he was de facto excommunicated by his loving God brothers on the GBC. At any rate, he made it clear that he regretted what the 11 had done and summed up the whole debacle by saying, quote, "We went way too far and we couldn't pull it off," unquote. Could not have put it better myself. Sadeva Samya.